Thank you for joining us again today. I hope that you're well, that everything's going well for you today. We appreciate this time together and these moments that we get to spend with each other. And we are looking at Romans chapter 8, and we're looking at the subject of victory in Jesus. And let me assure you again that there is victory in Jesus. We are looking at, in these moments, at verses 9 through 11. Let me read those to you again. But ye are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if so be that the Spirit of God dwell in you. Now if any man have not the Spirit of Christ, he is none of his. And if Christ be in you, the body is dead because of sin, but the Spirit is life because of righteousness. But if the Spirit of him that raised up Jesus from the dead dwell in you, he that raised up Christ from the dead shall also quicken your mortal bodies by his Spirit that dwelleth in you. So we are looking at, in these verses, at the subject of who is a Christian. Who is a Christian? What an important question that this is, and one that every individual should ask themselves. Who is a Christian? And there's three basic truths that we find about Christians in these verses. Now, yesterday we began to look at what a Christian is not, and we see that a Christian is not in the flesh. We are not in the flesh. We are not to live our life by the desires of the flesh, being captives, being prisoners, simply to our desires and what we want. And we know we're living in a sensual day. And everything around us is trying to grab our attention and to get us to dive into the desires of the flesh. But for a child of God, we are living in a different way. Let me remind you, we may be in this world, but we are not of this world any longer. And friend, there's no excuse for you and I to live our life simply by the desires of our flesh. And so we are no longer in the flesh. But now the next thing that we see is this, that we are not without the Spirit. And so the Bible again says that we are not in the flesh, but we are in the Spirit, if so be that the Spirit of God dwell in you. And so what we find is this, we now have the Spirit of God living in us. Now, we understand this. We can overcome the desires of our flesh and the drive of our flesh just by our own willpower, if you will. No, we need and we rely upon the Spirit of God. And so the Bible tells us that we are no longer in the flesh, but now we have the Spirit of God who lives within us. Now, you need to follow some of Paul's logic and what he says in these verses and understand that he means exactly what he says. Now, if you do not have the Spirit of God, then what Paul is saying is this: you don't belong to God. If you belong to God, you will have his Spirit. And if you have the Spirit of God, you will be controlled by the Spirit of God and not by your flesh. Now understand this. The Bible says here that we are in the Spirit, and the Spirit is in us, dear friend. You can't get more complete or more fulfilled than that. How are we going to live a righteous life in this world? How are we going to live a clean life and a moral life in this world? Well, I want to tell you, we can't do it on our own, and we need the Spirit of God, and we need to live our life in the strength and in the power of the Spirit of God. Now, remember this, dear friend, you're not alone. I'm not alone today. The Lord hadn't left us by ourselves, and so we are not without the Spirit. And I would say this, since we are not without the Spirit, that means this: we are without excuse. No excuse for me today not to live for the Lord. If I'm saved, there's no excuse for me not to live a separated and holy life unto Him. And the reason that I can do that is this: now the Spirit of God dwells within me. And so, dear friend, when we begin to think about the question of who is a Christian, we need to deal with what a Christian is not. I will tell you this: there's a lot of fakes. There's a lot of play actors, if you will. We call them hypocrites out there who say that they are Christian, but their life says something else. Our life ought to match up to our testimony. And know this, for us to really know who is a Christian, we must understand somewhat what a Christian is not. Well, till tomorrow, may the Lord bless you is my prayer.